Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frank Hoffe, and I would like to welcome you at our webinar on this Global Labor University online course, Post-Corona Starts Now. Our theme today is recovering and redirecting the labor agenda for post-corona. And I'm very glad to welcome two great speakers for our webinar today. It's Stephen Cotton, who is the General Secretary of the International Transport Workers Federation. Stephen is, now you are seeing James Ritchie. James is the Assistant General Secretary of the International Union of Food Workers. The IUF is organizing 10 million workers in the agriculture plantation industry, in the tobacco industry, in the food and food processing industry, and also in the restaurant, tourism, and catering industry. And our second speaker is Stephen Cotton. Hello, Stephen, who is the General Secretary of the International Transport Workers Federation. The International Transport Federation grew out, I think, in the beginning out of an organization of railway workers, seafarers, but is now organizing all transport workers around the world in roughly 150 countries and representing 20 million workers. So this is basically our two speakers. We want to focus today on the discussion what challenges labor is facing in this crisis and what are the ways labor might be able to move out of this crisis. And I would hand over to our director of the Global Labor University Online Academy, Adlira Jaffer, to start our conversation. Adlira, over to you.
Hello again. First question to Stephen. Stephen, many of your members are directly and massively affected by this crisis. The aviation industry has been grounded, the cruise industry has been devastated, and hundreds of thousands of seafarers are stuck on their ships and cannot get home. So what have been your immediate measures to help the members in this difficult time, particularly those who are already for many months now on ships and can't get home?
Thanks for that. Hi, Frank. Hi, James. It's, I think for all of us, it was an immediate reaction to a changing world. And I think we've been through a number of stages. We put together an internal task force to look at what were the critical points. And of course, for us, we identified that civil aviation was impacted the most. But we also looked at the issue about the ITF is directly involved in bargaining for seafarers. And other of our sectors that were being impacted. So for aviation, we put together kind of a list of demands that we wanted to put out to governments. We wanted to put out to our employers. We are represented in all of the major, what we would describe as legacy national airlines, where basically we've stuck to the point that governments should help employers sustain these industries while we try to rebuild and reconstruct a safe and stable environment. For us on the seafarers, it's been particularly interesting and some levels disappointing that the world doesn't really recognize the global supply chain. And seafarers from developing nations, in some cases, have now been on ships for up to 15 months. And literally, they can't get off because many of the borders have been closed throughout this pandemic. And even if they could get off, many of the planes they would have moved them either from the Philippines, India, Ukraine, are not flying. So for us on the seafarers side, been a massive challenge. But we've fully embraced the UN agencies, World Health, the Office of the United Nations Secretary General, International Maritime Organization, International Labour Organization, and ICAO for the aviation elements. So we've responded by listing, and actually in maritime, we've worked very closely with governments and employers. Cruise ships, an utter disaster. again, we cover the majority of the world's cruise ships with the seafarers and the seafarers that work in hotels, if that makes sense. That's been very difficult because of the sheer number of crew. Some of those ships have up to 4,000 seafarers on board, and some governments have come out of this very poorly, where they've sent disembarked passengers and refused to offload seafarers. That's been quite bad. I think for us, really it was a reaction of how do we respond with our affiliates, how do we share information, how do we build a clear message to both governments and to employers about how they need to respond. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Stephen. And a similar question about the most pressing issues of Corona and immediate response is also for you, James. You're representing workers from the food, beverage, hotel, restaurants, catering and agricultural sector. So food production continued during the crisis, and in particular meat production and slaughterhouses have become COVID-19 hotspots in many countries. Why is this the case, and what can you do to protect your members, and what needs to change in the industry?
I wonder if in the time that it is available, I think I should concentrate on meat processing, which is certainly meat and poultry processing, which has certainly been the most critical area in food processing for the hotspots for COVID-19. And I think that while food processing can be a problem, there is much more automation in food processing other than meat and poultry processing, and physical distancing in the rest of food processing is generally easier than it is in meat processing. And if we're going to understand what's happened in meat processing, we have to think about the organisation of work in that particular industry. And it is the classic Taylorist or Ford model of production, where there is an assembly line, or in the case of this industry, a disassembly line, where animals are slaughtered and then cut up in a process line, where workers stand side by side doing their jobs. And because the line speeds are so fast, people are very close together, and there is a concentration of a large number of workers in an enclosed space. The points where the COVID spreads are around locker rooms, cafeterias, entry to work, and so on. And so in terms of looking at what we need to do, the most fundamental thing that our affiliates have been working with companies and trying to make sure happens is that the line speeds need to be slowed. The production line speed has to be slowed so that there can be appropriate physical distancing between workers. There needs to be, of course, all of the normal approach to a hazard in the workplace. COVID-19 is an occupational disease. It is a hazard. It needs to be managed as a hazard in the workplace. And so there needs to be engineering controls and administrative controls to that hazard, which is barriers in appropriate places. It is the staggered shifts, staggered lunch breaks, stopping the bottlenecks in locker rooms, in the entry to the plant, and those things. There also needs to be attention paid to transport to and from work, so that there is not crowding in transport. Accommodation needs to be looked at, and so when workers are together in accommodation, it's not cramped or unsatisfactory accommodation. And really critically, there has to be adequate paid sick leave for workers in all jurisdictions, so workers can stay away from work when they're sick or when they have to quarantine without the economic pressures that are there, that are forcing workers back to work and infecting other people. That's absolutely critical. There are issues around ventilation, etc. But I think that the main message in making these workers safe is that there has to be negotiation between the unions and the companies in terms of making the environment safe on a long-term basis, so that workers can work safely. And there is a tendency, of course, to blame the worker. A lot of these workers are migrant workers, and it's our job and our affiliates' job to say it's the workplace that needs to be safe. It is nothing about who the worker is or where the worker comes from. It is about the obligation and responsibility for a safe workplace, and treating people with dignity and respect, and removing the exploitative model of production that is encouraged by meat and poultry processing.
Thank you, James. And Stephen, can I turn back to you with a question? You also mentioned that the aviation industry has been hit hardest by COVID-19, but there is obviously a situation now where Lufthansa, British Airways, KLM, Air France, and many others are getting billions of dollars to be supported. And at the same time, before the crisis, there has been a discussion that we might have too much air traffic and we should look at other forms of transport to protect our climate. So isn't this crisis not also the moment to think, on the one hand, how to protect the workers, on the other hand, to think how we make sure that the real costs of aviation is integrated into the prices people are paying, and that we do everything to protect our climate in a situation where we feel something has to change there. I know it's a difficult thing for someone who represents the workers who have their jobs there, but I mean, also all workers want a good climate, no?
I think that's a very challenging question, and something we've been musing about inside the ITF. So we had strong climate change, sustainable transport policy from 2010, and we only were really actively pursuing it in respect of urban transport. But we recognise, and since our Congress in 2018, we've relaunched the ITF's approach, albeit challenging for our affiliates. And I think this is I think you're right. This is a pivotal moment to have a conversation. And I think there's a couple of things. We work very closely with IUF and our other global union federations, but the voice of unions in the response to COVID, to me, feels like we've got an opportunity if we're coherent and working collectively. So if we look at aviation, and you rightly say there's a lot of government money, but ultimately that's society's money. So that's the conversation we need to address in how do we respond to the needs. Now, we have to be very careful because our unions are really struggling in our aviation sector, and it depends. Not every government is in a position to inject cash into the salaries and the sustainability. So there's questions at both levels, but I think we've seen, I have to say, we're incredibly disappointed with the British Airways approach, because they have literally given notice to many of their workers, and we feel there's a degree of cynicism in the approach, because on one hand they're taking support from government, on another hand they're saying you all have to reapply for your jobs. And of course the terms and conditions in British Airways have been built up over many generations, nearly all union represented. So there's challenges there, and this conversation about society's money does have to answer the balance between an equitable treatment of the workforce and a progressive response. And I think, you know, if going back to the initial point, that if unions can have a strong voice, you know, we kind of feel that we should be at the table sharing the problems, but also identifying the solutions. And I think for us, we also see that as a challenge in maritime shipping and pollution from shipping, but also from aviation. So I hope that sort of partnership, we've seen some good positive steps in certain, you know, immediate reaction. Certain governments have talked to the big unions about how to put in place those safety nets. James talked about minimum sick pay and those issues. It's just counterproductive if you don't have a decent level of sick pay, and particularly the issue of precarious work. So for us in the ITF, I think We're ready to engage with our affiliates. I will say to you, it's not easy in aviation sector. Many of the aviation workers, particularly those that fly, are very loyal to their companies. And the whole concept of the offsetting of carbon tax, to me, doesn't really feel to be addressing the problem. So we like the idea that the Air France money is conditional on sort of scrapping some of the short European flights. And, you know, we've been talking in our rail sector about high-speed trains. We see there's a big opportunity. But again, you need to have, I don't want to call it big government, but you need to have cross-border strategies to put this in place. You can't have a competitive element. We've seen in all of our history, and we're lobbying, albeit it's difficult to define exactly what we want aviation to look like, but we are lobbying to have a coherent global approach. And we do think the unions and the workers need to be part of that conversation. And we do believe that more work, and we believe the science is there, but more work needs to be done on aviation fuel, how we manage it, looking at, you know, and I think probably, James and I see more of each other now by video than we did before. The way we work is also going to change. And again, workers, unions should have a say about how we use video conferencing rather than jumping on a plane, which is kind of certainly part of my life for the last 20 odd years. So the reality for us is taxation, sponsorship, but perhaps more green strategies about how this works, but also talking to workers about securing their role in the transition rather than intimidating them. And some of the actions we've seen, for example, British Airways, is not the way to move us to a greener, more sustainable transport, because you tend to kind of draw up the battle lines when really it's about saving, when it should be about saving the planet, not dollars and cents, so to speak. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And James, turning to maybe the other industry which has been hit hardest by this crisis, that has been the restaurant and tourist sector, which is a sector your international federation is representing. And we all feel, and what we hear is there will be no quick return to mass tourism. I mean, that has effects on the aviation industry, but also on a lot of hotels, in particular in developing countries where a lot of tourists won't come. And I think what I've been reading, there have been two major challenges in that sector. One is you will have a huge amount of unemployed workers because there's been a massive wave of making people redundant. That normally results in downward pressure on wages. And the second question is those who keep their jobs, they are in a job where they're very closely related to customers. So their health risks, their health and safety risks are high. So how do you strategize to respond to these two risks? One, that you will have a further downward pressure on wages in the sector, and secondly, how can you protect the workers who go back to work and who are so closely working with a huge number of people that their health is not at risk?
In hotels and restaurants, that whole tourism and service industry, I guess it's just like Steve said about the aviation industry. Here is an industry that particularly hotels that disappeared overnight. In terms of not that the infrastructure is still there, the employers are still there, but unfortunately many workers were just laid off. Some with protection, some workers in Europe have been furloughed on pay for a period of time, but in many other jurisdictions workers were simply laid off. So they have no job. They don't have a connection with their previous employer to go back to. And so it is going to be very difficult to rebuild this industry in terms of the workforce and the unions. And without the unions organising in the industry, there will not be good wages, there will not be good conditions, there will not be safety. And I think there's an opportunity here for all of us, for governments, for unions, for employers, to build something that is a safe workplace and to lift standards. We can only have standards in these industries if we have regulation and if there is access to rights by workers, and particularly the rights to access the Conventions 87 and 98, the access to join a union, to organise and enter into collective bargaining. And we have to have much more widespread sector-wide collective bargaining to prevent the race to the bottom in terms of wages and conditions. And if we have an industry with standards, if we have tourism with standards, then we have a much less exploitative model of tourism. We encourage a tourism where people treat each other with dignity and respect, including employers treating the workers in the industry with dignity and respect. And you think about safety. It's of course what is on everybody's mind is COVID-19. But how many hotels have you been into with a big sign that says this is a sexual harassment-free workplace? You don't see it. It's not there. You might see no smoking, but you don't see this is a sexual harassment-free workplace. Now, when are we going to come to the party and see that one of the things that COVID has taught us is that in many ways there's no demarcation between community and workplace. The coronavirus doesn't make the demarcation. We must make sure that workers are seen as being part of the community that they live in, and it's not part of a race to the bottom to impoverish people. And we have standards, we have widespread collective bargaining, we lift this industry up. And the unions, Steve's federation, and getting people to the tourist destination, and our federation and our affiliates in terms of providing services to guests, we have to lift these standards, and they have to be across the board. And governments must play a role in creating and regulating for a much more decent society than we've had pre-COVID.
I want to turn to one of the challenges, Stephen, and also maybe James, for trade unions from a perspective of also reaching your members, and also for the broader challenge to democracy COVID-19 has been placing. I mean, trade unions have a history of meeting with their members, having trade union caucuses, discussing, and then take decisions. Now, a lot of your members are not at work. At a lot of places you can't assembly, so not all people are very familiar with doing Zoom conferences or whatever. So how do you consult with your members? How do you keep them active? And maybe you can give us some examples how you try to do this, because in a way there's a risk that COVID-19 is also challenging the way democratic organizations can work. So maybe, Stephen, you have the first shot. How do you do this?
Okay, I think we've been looking at, so obviously the role of a global union federation is to provide solidarity, coordination, policy development across all the sections. But the ITF's been looking, and I think we're very similar to James and IUF, about how we can be more dynamic across the multinational multinational companies. And I think this conversation between those multinationals and governments is some of the challenges that underpin what we're dealing with now with COVID, because you can see multinationals are more geared up to make decisions than governments, and there's a question of authority. So for us, I think we're trying to tackle it from both sides. And Unilever is one of those companies that IUF has a long history of sparring and battling with, and they brought us into a relationship when it comes to their supply chains and trucking, and we're very grateful for that. But I think for us, the key issue has been, so in transitioning, that issue about how do you connect to your members as a global union federation, that's the national unions, and their members, we've been looking at about how to be a bit more dynamic. And the reality is information technology, digital organizing, campaigning around workplace issues. At some level, we're looking to go back in time to be closer to the membership. And I think if we look through the history of different unions we've managed, some have managed to climb. I'm a big advocate of getting down, getting dirty and delivering. So for us, it means we have to have formulas and competitions with our competitive ways to kind of communicate and get people who aren't in unions back into unions. So we've been prioritising women, we've been prioritising young workers, we've been dealing with some of the kind of less traditional unions about the method of organising. So we've been working in the UK with a non-TUC affiliated union who's been organising, IWGB, who've been organising Deliveroo riders. And this is a very pop-up campaign orientated. And one of their processes in this was to get me to talk to their shop stewards. I'd call them more like activists, on a big screen, and they do that every week, and in whatever campaign. So I think there is some challenges for our unions. So the more traditional unions, those unions that need to get 50+1% in some very anti-union jurisdictions, are going to have to look at these new ways of organising. It's going to put more pressure on the global union federations, on the national unions. You know, it's not all about the meeting that you're going to, it's actually about the campaigns you're running. It's about being in real time. It's being able to convince and have the methods of delivering answers to those workplaces. Now, I think it's kind of a renewing challenge, but it's also quite invigorating. And it means we have to look at how we function and how do we deliver and how do we communicate. And I think similar to just this session and the privilege to be with all of you today, it's how do we engage with people? How do we convince people that the debates are right? And then that, I still believe that traditional model of arguing your point, building a coalition, building a consensus amongst the workers is as critical now as it's ever been. And I think, and I hope that COVID, and James said it very well as well, that the society isn't good enough. It's all about driving costs down. It isn't good enough to put people in precarious work positions, and governments have got to stand up. And you know, we're all anxious about how we're going to pay for this money. And for us, it's really, really critical that we build methodology. And just to answer the question, and not to go off all over the place, the reality for us is we've been working videos with regions, with the chairs of the sections. But you know, it's kind of strange. I'd say we've been doing longer hours through this COVID period because we've been trying to get across, and maybe we've been more ambitious about what we've asked for, and then we've asked for it, we've got to work out how we're going to go get it. And that's kind of, we have some brilliant people in the labour movement, and sometimes we're a little heavy on the policy and not strong on the implementation. And I think this is a challenge for us in this COVID period. You know, and I wasn't joking when I say I see more of James. We, in the Global Council, the global unions, we put everybody together. It's not always that easy. They all lead very important organisations with their own accountability and governance internally to try to say, well, how do we respond? So we've been talking about resilience, health and safety, so that we can show leadership, I think, is what is our objective, so that we can actually bring, you know, we know our unions are going to get hammered on numbers, and we know that there's going to be a critical moment both financially and in reality when it comes to fighting their way out of this. But I think, you know, history will tell, we have to do a good job. We have to provide the right policy, we have to deliver the right implementation, and we have to provide leadership. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And I want to turn, before we turn to the audience and the questions which have come up already on your comments, maybe one final question to you, James, to a group of workers who has been working very hard during COVID-19. This is the whole workers in the agricultural and food sector, because, I mean, it was amazing. Despite the crisis, we were all fed, we all could buy products in the shops, and there were people getting out every day to do this work. And a lot of these workers, in particular in agriculture, are in most, at least, North America, European countries, are very often seasonal migrant workers. And we have seen that at the same time, while they were feeding us, they were hit hardest on their own situation, because sometimes borders were closed, they couldn't get home, or they couldn't get back to work. And also, I think they are a particular high health risk, because their accommodation is very often very poor. And they're very difficult to organize, because they are seasonal workers and they are very often also afraid to lose a job. So I know the IUF has been working with migrant workers in agriculture for many years, but maybe you can say a few things, how you try to reach out to these workers at the moment, how you try to organize them, and again, what you think are lessons we see in COVID, what needs to change immediately to stop this kind of very exploitative labor practices in that area.
This is a very challenging area, but I think we go back to what Steve was saying, you know, about organising and policy, etc. The politics is very important, but the politics isn't worth anything unless we're organising. And I think that it's really important to convey to all workers that all workers are equal, all workers' contribution is the same, and that it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, or your gender, or your sexual orientation, or your ethnic background, etc. This is a principle of the union movement. We respect and support everyone, every worker, and so I think we have to convey both to workers themselves, both native workers and migrant workers, that that what is pitting workers against each other in terms of the modern right-wing populist nationalist philosophy is what is driving poverty at the moment, is driving your poverty, and a migrant worker's poverty is even poorer relative to your poverty. And so we have to get back to that principle of the job. Whoever's doing the job should be treated the same way, should have the same wages and the same conditions. And we have to attack subcontracting. I think the legislation that is being introduced by the German government to ban subcontracting in the meat industry is absolutely critical in the protection of migrant workers and treating them the same. Doing the same work, they should be treated the same, etc. So I think that one of the great ironies of the food supply chain is that those people who produce our food, agricultural workers and poor farmers, are amongst the least able to afford the food often that's produced. So it's really important that we in our organising force the hand of multinational companies and their supply chain to make sure that the decent work goes right down the supply chain. Start asking them what's going on with cocoa production, for example, in the Ivory Coast, in terms of why is there still child labour. It's not about setting up another foundation, it's about paying a reasonable price for the product that is got, and paying proper living wages for the work that is done, no matter where you are in the supply chain. And we just have to move away from this current model to build up a trading and employment situation and respect between nations and respect of employment that does that. Now, in terms of organising migrant workers, I mean, there are a number of our affiliates that do an absolutely magnificent job. Affiliates in Australia, affiliates in Italy and elsewhere, in making workers who are visitors to those countries to feel that they are really welcome, that they are entitled to the same wages and conditions as anybody else doing that job, and to fighting for those rights. So in terms of migrant workers, it's difficult, language, cultural barriers and all the rest of it, but we have to, as a labour movement, we have to reflect in our organisation our values and the people that we represent, and we must make every worker feel completely comfortable in our unions. And until we're able to do that, then there will always be great difficulty in organising migrant workers or other groups of workers.
Thank you, James. And Adlira, can I hand over to you? I've seen you have been following the questions which came in the chat, so maybe you can share them with us and with our panelists.
Well, several questions are coming from the people that are attending the webinar. A question from Emily Kabegi from the Philippines, who is discussing the modernization program of the government of the Philippines for e-jeepneys, which started a few years ago and was faced with massive resistance from the jeepney operators, tens of thousands of those actually, who cannot afford this transition to e-jeepneys. And then the COVID hit, and these people now have been actually stopped from going and working and really getting their livelihood. So Emily is asking, how do you green the transport sector, referring particularly to the case of the Philippines, without sacrificing the survival of the thousands of drivers?
Just for the ITF, we've been involved in we have what we call national coordinating committees. So the original issue, we have 2 unions very active in the jeepney sector. So we have written to the government, that's a pretty challenging government at every level, to talk about how do you make it affordable, because the reality is, and we see this across all modes of transport, the objective to drive transportation costs down so low means it's very difficult to turn it into a green, sustainable transport model. So we lobbied we've got 2 road transport unions, as I said. One of them is really a community organisation, and they were the ones that really took to the streets, and some of them were arrested, some of our leaders. We made protests to try to get them released. I think for us, we've got to find ways to turn the system. So, you know, we have got a couple of examples. The World Bank is not very popular in trade union circles, but some of these urban renewals, we've been working with them to add that human element, that if you're displacing precarious transportation, and there's a lot of positives in it, because you can make sure that people are very health and safety conscious. Some informal transportation does have issues of alcohol, drug abuse, fatigue, unsafe equipment, and those issues are not something we can support. So the challenge is, how do you get into a position? So we've got projects going on in Nairobi, Bogota, where we've kind of fought the World Bank over how to introduce a human element, so that you have to have a consultation process. And part of that conversation is, how do you guarantee these, at the moment, owner-operator models, how do you guarantee them that they will have a good job, a union, that we're arguing obviously a unionised job, so that you actually take those people into the process and you build, and again, James is right, you can't do that without organising, building confidence, government support. So that's the challenge. You can't take all these people who can't afford, you know, and some of the proposals about the replacement vehicles were very expensive and frankly unsustainable in that market, which is kind of totally dependent on that very informal method of the jeepneys, a very informal historical route. So I think the conversation is, get the stakeholders to understand consequences, but you've got to build, and you know, James was talking about communities. If you don't do this from the community, you immediately have the reaction, and without the jeepneys, you can stop the Manila and the other big cities in the Philippines. So for us, it's like building a conversation with government. It's difficult in certain places, but also saying to the World Bank, you can't go in there and just rip up the history and the society. You've got to engage with the human beings that have underpinned this system.
Thank you for that. A question to you, James. It's a bit related to what you're discussing earlier about migrant workers, but Olga is asking, in particular in the case of Europe, is discussing the question of migrant workers in agriculture, in which the Europe so much depends on. And then she's asking particularly what's been the IOF involvement in protecting these workers during this crisis.
Yes, I think that's related to what I was saying before. I'm not sure that I have a lot more to add, except that it is very important that when borders are open between countries to allow migrant workers to come and work backwards and forwards, that needs to be a regulated process. I mean, regulated in the sense that that the workers aren't unduly exposed to COVID through the transport to get there or through their accommodation on farm. And we've been working in terms with the ILO, with the World Health Organization around these issues, and to try and encourage them to encourage governments to put in place very stringent measures that protect not only exposure to COVID, but it protect against the kind of gangmaster behaviour which exploits workers. I mean, mostly in Europe, we're talking about workers that come from Eastern Europe to Western Europe to work in agriculture. And we have to make sure that those workers aren't exploited in the process. I mean, by having to pay for accommodation, overinflated prices for accommodation, pay for their transport there, pay fees to actually get a job, those sorts of things. We are calling for the increase in labour inspection. We believe governments have to invest much more heavily in labour inspection. It can't just be left to civil society, to unions and other forms of civil society to monitor what's happening without appropriate resources. So we have to have appropriate resources, of course, but governments need to help and regulate in that. So I think that what all of this is leading to is that coming out of this pre-pandemic world through the pandemic, and what some corporates are calling the new normal. Well, yes, we want a new normal too, but that normal looks a lot different to what happened before, and it's a normal in which all workers are treated with dignity and respect. And there is no, as Steve was saying before, there is no future in countries not working together. There is no future in no cooperation across borders between host countries and the countries of origin for migrant workers. There has to be much stronger communication and regulation that happens there. There has to be much stronger monitoring of migrant worker flows, and putting in the processes that treat those workers with the dignity and respect that they deserve, and gives them all the information they need so that they can access their rights. It's not about according these workers' rights, they have rights. It's helping workers to access those rights, and including rights to access union membership and collective bargaining.
A question which goes perhaps to both of you. The COVID has demonstrated that unions need to use different digital solutions to address different problems of their members, especially in developing countries. Are the unions supporting online training enough and enabling grassroots leaders to use and access online resources for information, communication, research, and education? What are your experiences with this, and what can be done to improve the current situation?
I'm happy to go first, or James. I think, as I said, we were already moving into this space, and many of the projects that we had that kind of were supposed to be physical seminars have actually turned into a different kind of education and process. So where we were looking at, for example, we recognise that we're rather weak in aviation in Asia Pacific. So we recognise Asia Pacific as a very critical economic area, which in some countries has strong union density, but the norm is lower union density than we would like to see. So we prioritise that, but we were looking at low-cost airlines. So we've had to change it up a bit, because you can't, normally you'd have the pleasure of doing two or 3 days workshopping, explaining, as basically issues about how unions work, but more about the organising. We really are advocates of organising, and we're now trying to rejig. Last year we did a summer school for urban transport workers. This year it will be young, and this is for our young workers in aviation. And again, we'll be doing it virtually, about how do we transfer those skills. And in reality, irrespective of the economic position, many of our African and Asia Pacific membership or potential membership are pretty good at mobile phones. And we need to look and recognise that mobile phones are becoming more and more prevalent. How we communicate, so like long missives don't hold people's attention. We've got to be sharp, and we've got to get the point across culturally first, and then in reality capture their attention. I would say some of our older unions, let's put this in the right term, some of our unions from the more developed world are, sometimes it's even difficult to get them to go to a workshop. I mean, the reality is, and I think we are very strong on this, that we think it's not about the union bosses talking to union bosses. If we want to organise on the ground, it's worker to worker. And the commonality between regions is much more prevalent than people realise. And to come out for James and the meat workers, it doesn't really seem to matter where you are in the world. In that, the way that methodology is rolled out, the health and safety angle is not being respected. The employment of migrant workers in what is tough physical work is being shown to be one of those unjust sectors that needs to be higher regulated. And that, that's probably one of the few positives of COVID, is that ability for us to kind of join up what's not working and come out with strong positions against and support each other in those areas. Thank you.
Yes, I think in some ways that this is an issue where the membership has to educate the leadership about the use of the technology, because as Steve said, our members in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they're very adept with the mobile phone, as they are, in Europe and North America as well. But it is something that we need to be able to communicate in a way that reflects the way that they communicate. I mean, for example, we, at least since the 90s, we've communicated by email all the time, and email is still a very useful business communication, but it's not the way our members communicate with each other. Nothing like it, So how do they communicate? How do they build their organisation with the technology that's available? And I think that one of the things that I struggle with, and I suspect that Steve's the same, is that this union leadership is built on relationships, and relationships are always best forged at a personal level and at a physical level. So what we're grappling with at the moment is, how do we forge those kinds of relationships in a virtual world? And how do we have meetings where we can't read the body language or read the signals and those sorts of things? Now, we have to learn that. We have to communicate that. We have to learn from our members about that. But I cannot imagine a situation where I would sit down in serious negotiations with an employer in a virtual setting, because it's just so difficult without reading all the signs and things like that. So it's a huge challenge, and I just repeat, really, we're finding our way with this, particularly these kinds of meetings.
Can I come in here for a minute with maybe a bit of the elephant in the room in some of the questions, really? I mean, you have both been saying, look, we are in conversations with employers, we are in conversations with governments, we need more kind of regulation to set a floor, to set a standard. The labor movement has been saying this for a long time. And at the end of the day, the question is always, what changes the minds of governments? And that's basically if you have some sort of power, which brings me to the question, I mean, you are representing sectors which are potentially very powerful. I mean, food is something which needs to be produced speedy and is essential, but also transport is it's basically the arteries of the global economy. So is there a way also to say, look, this is what needs to happen, and this is the kind of actions we can take to mobilize and to create the amount of power we need to do this? I think that's something we are all grappling with. I mean, how do we make that change, which you so eloquently both explain is needed, actually happen? And how can we create that kind of alliance as you were speaking about? Maybe that can be a bit of an outlook for our discussion, that you give us some examples where you think that can happen or that's already happening.
I think could say, well, what's different now? And I think that's what we've been talking about in the Global Council, that, you know, James, we're fairly new to it, if that's the right way of describing it. So I've been in position for 7 years. And when I came, there were all kind of grandees of the global union movement who'd been there for 20 years and above. So the reality is we've got new people who, to put this in the right way, it's less about turf and more about delivery. And I think that's where we have to get on with the reality of, if we have a good idea, let's share it. If we can move something in a region, let's move it. If we, you know, the reality to me is, and you know, it goes to the very density of union numbers, we're not moving quick enough to react to the situations in the workplace. So it is all about density. You know, there's a question on the panel about how have governments treated seafarers? Well, I would say appallingly. And we're a reasonably powerful global union federation. But when we went out to everybody and say, let's stop the ships or get off because you've now worked 15 months, they then start to worry about, well, what about my job? Do I get blacklisted? Will I get penalised? And these are the things, the same fundamentals that we were dealing with when we created unions hundreds of years ago, we still have the same challenge. Now for us, I think we need to connect with young people. We need to look at women and how we treat them in the society and argue and empower them to help us be better unionists. Because the reality is, you know, we see pop up NGOs who are quicker and more on the point, and we have to compete with them to get governments to pay attention to us. Now, I'm hoping, and I think we're all hoping, in that employers have actually recognised, some employers, and there are some better employers than others, that having a collective workers' voice gives you a better platform to react to a crisis like COVID. So we're hoping that that potential behaviourism can be promoted. Now, we want to align with the Unilevers who want to pay from point to point social standards in every country that they work on. And we want the consumers to recognise that there should be no child labour. We want them to be able to transparently check that there was unionised labour and there's a health and safety culture and there's no child labour. But that means we have to change a bit as well, because we can't be so, this is my space, this is what I'm a union that represents these set of workers. Some of the losses that we've got from precarious workers were created by our own unions taking too long to recognise that they have to represent the subcontracted worker, the precarious worker, and it doesn't. I think our industries are similar. Like if we talk warehousing, there's day workers in Sri Lanka who come out of the agricultural areas and are bid for in kind of concepts of 300 years ago, sort of gang labour. So these issues about how do we learn to be less cautious, to be less conservative on the big issues, I think is part of the way we have to change. And our message has to be united and clear, and not look, and unfortunately, James won't mind me saying this, sort of Anglo-Saxon white male of a certain age. We also need to freshen up our image as a whole, because we want to be inclusive, we want to be representative, and it's kind of critical. And I think it's a moment in time that will prove that activism in all of its multiple forms is more critical now than it's ever been before. Sorry, went a bit on there, but okay.
Yeah, I think that's all true. So it's what I can add to what Steve said, rather than anything different. But I think that it's really important that the union movement aligns with the most important movements, progressive movements of the age. So, for example, the climate crisis is an existential crisis facing us all. So we have a choice as unions. We can be part of the problem or part of the solution. Now, the difficulty that we have, and I take about the food sector, for example, the difficulty that we have is that our members rely on jobs which are actually jobs which are products of a completely unsustainable system. So how do we maneuver, how do we get on the side of young people demanding that we do something about the climate crisis and defend the interests of our members while we're doing that? Well, we think about this quite a lot, and the way that I see that we do this is that we have to be really strong and demanding of governments and employers that workers are just not simply tossed on the scrap heap of history in a model of destructive capitalism that changes. That the move towards a sustainable food sector means that workers in the sector have to change with the change in a way in which they transfer into decent employment. And unless that happens, then we'll have the union movement, the organised union movement, being resistant to change. It's absolutely needed. It's the same with Black Lives Matter. We have to stand on the side of anti-racism, anti-discrimination of any sort. We have to stand with young people. We have to do all of those sorts of things, and we have to be part of a progressive movement for change, and not. I think we've made mistakes in the past. I'm guilty of it myself, of too much aligning ourselves with social democratic or Labour parties that have been seen by our members to act against their interests in certain things, like whether it's trade and investment agreements, for example, but there are other things as well. We have to step out of that. We have to clearly identify ourselves with the progressive movements in the world that are aligned with achieving social justice for all people.
Very interesting. Some of these are resonating with the questions that are coming here. I don't know whether you can stay a bit longer, because we said 1 hour, but it's going beyond 1 hour. But there are questions coming. For instance, Stephen, there is a question to you about whether from Melissa, whether ITF is considering pushing for conditionalities, for instance, job preservation for the government bailouts for airline companies. And would you also consider employee ownership corresponding to the bailout in these companies, or some form of nationalization, government equity participation as a result of the bailouts, for instance?
For us has been some of our unions, again speaking very frankly, struggled to react to the reality that they were confronted with. So unions have their status quo position, and now we have to go, right, let's think big. How are we going to respond to this? There are a number of examples of unions talking to governments and making proposals. It doesn't all reach the mass media that can't always rely on, but the reality is there are a lot of meetings in a lot of our global north countries where our unions are actually in consultation. Our colleagues in Australia have been responding with a kind of a very anti-union government, but there's been a lot of conversations. I can talk about here in the UK, there's been the big group of unions talking to the governments at the initial stages. And we kind of, that gives us a bit of optimism that you can look at how this works. And I think part of, you know, I don't want to harp on about British Airways, but the population as a whole, whether it's left or right or whatever political orientation, recognises that if a government puts money in to sustain industry, they don't expect that company then to immediately sever all the ties. They expect a responsible, you know, fair play methodology. Now, if we're not in that circle, no one's going to define what are the best practices of fair play, or treating the workers with, or decent work, or treating the worker with respect. So for the ITF's perspective, yes, anything can happen about renationalisation. And I think, you know, we aspire that the big conversations about the, you know, some of the examples we've seen of big companies that literally only have 3 months cash flow and then stop paying people, or it's just kind of utterly ridiculous when we know of the billions that are siphoned off in various tax havens and those challenges. So there's a big issue here about governance, and governance has to make sure the sustainability, and, you know, the labour inspectors are part of that auditing process. The due diligence methodology about health and safety. We just launched, you know, again, this is connected to the work we've been doing with James and Unilever. We just launched an expose in Europe, which is supposed to have some of the best labour conditions in the world, of subcontracted non-European truck drivers being discriminated against, bullied, harassed, and working overtime. And, you know, and when we put that stuff out, we are challenging that debate. And this is the issue. You know, you can't disrespect workers if you want to have a society that appreciates everyone's contribution. You know, in the UK and across Europe, we've been clapping for our national health workers, and we couldn't be more proud and more supportive of the frontline response. But you kind of already feel, as the COVID threat goes down, some of those workers are already falling back into, you know, we couldn't survive in many of the medical without the workers of the world picking up the jobs that need to be done, you know. And you know, we're really strongly, and I know I'm not answering the question directly, but the, you know, the role of cleaners has never been more important, yet society's put that at, in some levels, the lowest pedestal, and that's totally unacceptable, because that's kind of an abuse of people's contribution. And well, like, you know, I think we are generally optimistic that if we get our arguments collectively right, people are ready to move to a better kind of society, and not all about the lowest possible cost, and not all about manufacturing it halfway across the world that's then left us clambering over each other and outbidding for personal protection equipment. So for us in the ITF, we're kind of committed to working with our colleagues in the other global union federations. And it means sometimes we have to have more difficult conversations, and it's even more difficult by video. But the reality is much better to have a consensus and to have a powerful challenging ourselves about what we want, or what the workers want, or what society wants coming out of this crisis. Thank you.
So can I put through to you a very final question? So I'll try to put together, and it's to both of you, I'll try to put together two interrelated questions by Marcus and Richard. Marcus is saying that how can a just transition be achieved in a sector like transport or food sector if we think about the fact that the real challenge is actually the climate crisis, and the COVID has just given us a glimpse of what may be required actually to come down to responding to such challenges. And related to that, the question from Richard, would it actually be too optimistic to suggest that the vulnerabilities of our societies and economies now exposed by the COVID highlight the case for decent work, and that's to mean work that can survive a short-term suspension of activity? So over to you also for closing remarks on this. Thank you.
James?
Yeah, want me to go first on this one, Steve? Good. Yes, I think there's something. You have to be an optimist if you're a trade unionist. It's part of the job description, if you like. But honestly, and I am, and I think that one of the things about this pandemic is that it is showing the absolute philosophical deficiency of the kind of philosophy that had taken hold pre-pandemic. We're talking about libertarian philosophy, neoliberal philosophy, individualism, all the rest of it. Well, what's been exposed by that? First of all, public health. You have the flashiest, best equipped hospital in the world, but you can't do anything about the transmission of a disease like COVID-19 because it requires a public health response. It requires a collective response. There is an opportunity here, not just in terms of the narrow opportunity about health and safety in the workplace, which is a real opportunity and one which we must take up as trade unions. It's one of the core early reasons why trade unions were founded in the first place, for safer conditions, and that's come rushing back to be a core issue for trade unions everywhere. So we have to challenge that individualism. We have to challenge neoliberalism, say, how did that work with your COVID-19? Because the most neoliberal countries have generally struggled the most with this. We think about the US, the UK, and others. Whereas where there has been a much better public health, and I mean public health in terms of the broader terms, there has been better ways of doing it. Where there has been strong political leadership, there has been, the countries have coped much better with COVID-19. All of those kinds of things are important. So if we're thinking about the future, we are optimistic to think that this is a taster of things to come in terms of what's happening with the climate crisis, what is likely with future pandemics with zoonotic diseases. So how do we prepare ourselves as society to be resilient as a society, not as individuals, as communities, as societies, as workplaces? And it means that we have to have workplaces which are not just designed for the maximisation of profit for shareholders, but they have to be designed to be sustainable for the communities in which they live. And that means reshaping systems like transport systems and food systems, which is better for the planet, and which means that there is a transition for workers into building different skills, into different jobs. But in doing that, they have to be protected. They can't be just thrown, out to the wolves, which is basically poverty, losing their homes, their incomes, they can't sustain their families, etc. We have got to find a much better way of support, and it is an obligation of governments to do that, and it's our obligation to organise to get powerful enough so that governments have no choice but to put in the social supports for workers, which allows a transition where we can transition to a sustainable future.
Yeah, so I again, very great answer, James. For me, I think it's very similar, and it is about building the power, recognising and hoping and aspiring to encourage people to think in a different way. Because if it's all about minimum cost, we'll continue to build the inequitable gap between the super rich and the people that have to work to sustain themselves literally hand to mouth. So for us, it's more about looking at things in a different way. And you can look at this whether you recognise that aviation is part of the infrastructure of a good society, that you regulate it and you limit it and you manage it in a way that helps build economies and doesn't pollute. Or you can look at cities and public transport You know, the politics of some of our North American cities, where the deprived areas literally have no infrastructure support when it comes to transportation, that crystallizes the unjust nature of some of the policy making. And policy making can't just be about who can get the most votes or the most populist approach. We've got to start underpinning again, and you know, underpinning the societal questions, so that there is a debate in Europe about how do we deal with high-speed trains, as an example, but it could be public health. How do we make sure that you know, the issue of racism, which is also connected to education, where you live, opportunities, how do we answer some of those questions in a way that challenges the very way that things have been constructed over hundreds of years, and not be afraid of how difficult those conversations potentially are. And then we as a labour movement, you know, we have to look at ourselves about how do we make sure we're relevant enough in density, in politics, and James said it, on the core issues that matter. If the future as it's described to us on climate change, we in the ITF struggled with our own internal politics when it comes to shipping and to aviation, but we know we can't stay in that position. And we have to challenge our leaders, even if it's a difficult conversation with a membership. And I think, you know, you asked some very challenging questions, and that's the right way forward, because the audience here will work out whether we're entitled to be in a leadership position and whether we're relevant to the conversations that we need to have. So I think key position for all of our unions is build more power, do more organising, but above all else, be relevant on their key issues. Thank you.
Dear Stephen and James, thank you so much for taking the time for this webinar. I know you are both hyper busy to dealing with COVID-19, and squeezing in an hour to talk to a webinar is a great contribution. We have set up this course for exactly the ideas the two of you expressed at the end. We want to contribute to a debate. What is the solution? How can labor connect with other social movements? How can we have an open debate? There are a lot of questions. We don't have all the answers, but we will only find the answers, I think, if we put the questions and if we say this is what we want to do. I also want to thank the participants. They have put forward great questions through all our seminars. Please tell others that the webinar is still open, and we will also think together with the global unions and with the two of you, but also others, how we can use the Global Labour University more as a platform for this kind of discussions, which we really need to do and which we can do. We have the technology for that. And I think there is also a desire after the shock of COVID-19, how do we move forward? So thanks again for joining us. Thanks for the participants. Thanks for the questions. And a big, big thank you to Adlira, our director, who has been managing this course in a magnificent way. So thank you, everybody. Stay healthy and all the best.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.